Welcome everybody to Oregon State University's Permaculture Design Pro class. We are the summer-fall 2023 class, and we've got a rather big class. We've got about 35 students as of today. I tend to get extra students because I take on the international students as well as the cold climate and some of the harder tropical areas. My name is Javan Bernakevitch. I own and operate All Points Design. That's allpointsdesign.ca. You will unfortunately hear my voice a lot in this course because I did all the tutorials for the template, so I apologize for that. You'll probably get sick of me introducing myself over and over again, but you'll know who I am. And with a name like mine, it's a little bit of back pay for all the people who weren't able to pronounce my name properly when I was growing up. I've been involved in permaculture since 2009. When I took my very first PDC at OUR One United Resource Eco Village over in Shawnigan Lake in British Columbia, Canada. And since then, I've had a great career, and I've been very lucky and blessed to work in a number of different countries. So when I started off, I was mostly working in British Columbia, Canada. And then I had the opportunity to work in Cuba with a colleague of mine. We ran a 21-day traveling PDC that went all over the island of Cuba, and we got to work with our Cuban compatriots. And part of that PDC, it was really fun. At the last 10 days, we got an opportunity to design and install and work with a couple of Cuban farmer friends of ours, put in ponds and gardens and things of that nature. And then a little while later, in about 2013, I had the opportunity to go to Kenya with Michael Nichols of Seven Ravens Farm. And we developed and designed the very first Practical Permaculture Institute of Kenya. And now there's a number of Practical Permaculture Institutes in Eastern Africa. I was in charge of the water systems there and was able to develop and design water systems that fed the sites that were able to then produce in the order of about 5,000 to 10,000 trees a year. And then I got the opportunity to work in Uganda. And at that point, I started getting more and more requests and interest to work internationally. So I had the opportunity to work now. I'll just get everybody to mute yourselves. I'll mute y'all. Here we go. I had the opportunity to work internationally and also do more design work and do a lot of teaching work. So where was I there? And then in 2020, I had an idea that a lot of what I was seeing within the circles that I ran in was a lot of polarized behavior. A lot of, if you're not part of my ism or myology, then you are somehow less than. And so I developed an online educational platform called regenerativliving.online, which teaches practical skills to live on the planet as if we intend to stay. Being in this field for now about 15 years, I've made a lot of connections. And so now we're running very specific courses about introductory skills, masterclass conversations. So we just finished a rainwater harvesting course with Gord Baird, who's one of the most skilled rainwater harvesters and treaters on the planet. We also have been running some great courses about propagation. And the last thing that I've been involved in, if you haven't had a chance to read my introduction, is I work a lot in life design, because as I started to get deeper into permaculture and into ecological systems and principles, I realized that we are ecology, and it's one of our major issues of how we've gotten to where we're at on the planet today. And so I started to apply ecological principles to life, to individuals. This included working with Alan Savory's holistic management, which developed into values-based decision-making, which is the ability to make decisions based on the value of what we want to see in the future versus a tangible something. Helps us to become inoculated against corporate capitalistic culture, as well as just being conscientious about how we make choices on a daily basis. It's kind of the long and the short of it for me. I got involved with OSU about 6 years ago. And then about 4 years ago, I developed the OSU template, which is a constantly evolving document. So you find things that need fixing, or if you have good suggestions, feel free to pass them along and we'll work with them. This hour that we have together, which will be every other Monday, up until the end of the course, excluding the break, is an opportunity to ask any question under the sun about permaculture, about any of the design elements, any of the template assignments, or if you want to bring a question specifically about your site. I'm not here to design your site, but I am here to provide feedback. And so pretty regularly, people will ask questions specifically about their sites, or what do I do in this situation? And when you do that, and I'll kind of walk everybody through this, the request is that you post your site project. So I'm just going to start sharing my screen here to show everybody our document. So everybody should have access to this document at this point. And if somebody wouldn't mind, please copy and paste the URL into our Zoom chat here. You'll all have access to edit this document, so please be conscientious about that, because it's very easy to mess it up. But the format of the student questions that I'm asking for here is to put in first your name, where you are in the world, and then a link to your project site. Even if you can't make the call, you can always post your question, and I'll walk through the questions as we work through it. Below that, what you'll find is there's some resources. This is a master resource list that I've been compiling now for 15 years. So on our tab 1, we have resources by topic. These can be videos or books or any number of different categories. There's also a new section for podcasts, which has been lovingly put together by a colleague of mine. And then I'm developing a new section for some web resources. You can ignore that for now. This is just my own personal accounting of different elements that I've picked up over the years. So you're welcome to play with that if that's of interest to you. A lot of you are going to have questions about how do I ID plants. And so this is a growing list of applications and also different subreddits to understand and to ask questions about what plant is this. You do not need to become a plant expert over these next 20 weeks, but it helps to start to get a sense of different plants. And then these are some pretty common books that people have asked about or comes up as we're talking. The permaculture design course is not a class on growing food. However, there's always questions about it, so I'm happy to answer them. I farmed for a little while on a couple of different occasions there. And then there's some upcoming courses of interest that might be curious for folks there. And then we've got our first questions. This is great. So I think I'm just going to jump into question number 1 here from Luisa, who's in Portugal. My site is in Portugal, Mediterranean climate, subtropic. I have trouble finding detailed climate data with the resources provided in the course. Can you help me find out? Specifically, I need watershed information. Yeah, so generally when we're taking a look at watershed information, we usually, if you haven't gone through the tutorials yet, I highly recommend you do. One of the first things you'll start taking a look at is Watershed Portugal or River Watershed System in Portugal, just to get a sense of that big map. That map will give you a sense of generally what are the different watersheds there, and then you can drill down. Now, there may not be a detailed watershed map of your area. There's not always all information for all areas in the places that we live. Information on major airstreams that play a role in local climate, that's even harder to find. That's hard to find anywhere in the world. So you can sometimes take a look at the major jet streams, which gives you a little bit of information, but it's not necessarily as needed. Gorges mountains, major airstreams, watersheds that form the local climate, as explained in video 15 on the example of Portland. I'm aware that this cannot be covered in such detail for every student's location. I rather wonder if there is a general guidelines on how to work these out things in an environment I'm not familiar with. Which web pages to consult in Europe, which comprehensive books to read. My goal is to be able to perform such a macro to micro site analysis myself to come up with a site assessment that accounts for the flows that influence to the site and a resilient design plan, as Andrew puts it. Thanks a lot. Yeah, so generally, because I tend to work internationally, I get given any number of different spots, and we're not always going to find all the information we're looking for, and nothing ever supplants actually being on site and going and taking a look at a site, being present there. So that's always going to be the first and foremost step that we're going to want to take, is to be on site, to talk with our local neighbors, to talk with folks that have been there for a long time and start to understand it. In terms of elements like gorges and mountains, so in terms of the topography of a landscape, one of the things that can be useful if we're using it at scale is the data that comes out of Google Earth. So Google Earth had a shuttle radar topographic mission, SRTM, in 2000 that NASA flew the world, and it was flying LiDAR, light image detection and radar. And it gave us a sense of what was the topography of the planet. Problem is that each one of those pixels was 30 meters in length, which means that if your site has 30 meters in elevation difference on site, which most of yours will, it will have interpolated, it will have guessed that material, which means that the information that comes off of Google Earth is not very accurate when we start to get to a smaller scale. So we need to be conscientious about that. Again, airstreams are hard to find in the best of conversations. There is a great wind data site that we have listed, which I would suggest taking a look at, which can give you a bit of conversations about that. Number 2, in video 15, Andrew quotes the problem as the solution and asks us to figure out how the problems of the site can be turned into solutions. 3 months of drought, high risk of fire due to eucalypt monocultures. I cannot think of making that useful for the site. Do you have any ideas? Right. So one of the things that we take a look at with the idea of the problem is the solution is, why did we get into the problem in the first place? So similarly, I've been living in British Columbia for a long time, and we have a huge fire issue, mostly because in our situation, when forestry came over from specifically Germany into North America during colonization, they brought with it the thoughts that, well, we just leave the forest as is. We don't have to worry about thinning, and we also don't have to allow for fires to actually propagate, which was an issue because fires have co-evolved with ecology, which allows it to have fuel reduction, as well as having a number of co-evolutionary elements like serotinous cones, which are necessary to open with heat and with fire. So one of the ideas in our biome, when I take a look at it, is the problem is the solution. So we have a huge amount of fuel within our forests, and I don't know if that's similar within Portugal, but with our situation, that problem leads us to start to think a little bit uniquely that, what can we do with that fuel, or how can we return that fuel into some kind of ecological process, composting process? Can it become habitat? Can it become nursery material for other types of animals or flora? So similarly, looking at the idea that there's a high risk of wildfires due to eucalypt monocultures, the problem being the solution there is there may be an opportunity to educate and to start to move those eucalypt monocultures into polycultures, into native forest polycultures. There may be an opportunity to take eucalypts and turn them into a product or into something of value in that area. Again, the 3 months of summer drought, which we're seeing on the west coast of British Columbia, and it's kind of moving into 4 or 5 months of drought, gives us an opportunity to learn more about rainwater harvesting, about increasing water holding capacity in the soil, or increasing and developing earthworks. So we have smaller reservoirs of water that'll then allow us to have extra water within our area. So part of it isn't necessarily that fires are the solution. Sometimes it's about pulling the lens back and saying, well, how did we get into this situation? What can we use there? So looking at what you've said here, I would say where can we use eucalypts? What is the value of them? That would lead into a rabbit hole of education and research. And then on the other side, 3 months of summer. So if you haven't checked out Tamara in Portugal and Sepp Holzer's fine work, it's a good one to take a look at, because he developed 2 large lakes that were built as fire protection. Specifically was how they were able to get it through the local regulations. 3, Portugal is threatened by bushfires, a diminishing water table, and droughts. Everybody blames the Eucalypt monocultures here, but I believe that's not the only reason. How can I find comprehensive analysis that is honest and unbiased? How would you go about research like that? So generally, I read everything. I read both sides of the table. I read everything I can find to understand a problem in a situation. So if I was in this situation, I would probably start to reach out to those that are working both in ecology, but those that are also working in natural resource extraction. There will have been a number of like-minded, ecologically focused individuals that have been focused on something like this already. I would reach out to them to interview them and to start to understand the conversation about that. And it's never one thing. So, part of this is also starting to pull back the lens and saying, there's never going to be one monoculture on anything. This is one of the major issues with climate change. Only focusing on carbon is a monoculture metric. There's lots of different metrics when we're getting into changing climate and anthropological, ecological disruption. So whenever I hear that there's only one culprit, that's a great example, or it starts ringing a red flag in the back of my mind that we don't understand the problem completely, because it's always going to be a spectrum. There's always going to be multiple elements that are applying here. So that's how I would go about it. I would start to interview people. I would start to research. I would start to understand if you're a child of divorce as I am, there's always mom's story, dad's story, and the truth is someplace in the middle. And I found that to be true generally about life. There's never going to be somebody who's got a monoculture hold on the truth. There's always going to be different factors. It's this idea of looking at a forest and having different people at different states or places or heights all around and inside a forest, and everyone's going to have their own view of that forest. So the truth is quite subjective. I've found as we're taking a look at these different sites and these different understandings. I ended up visiting a colleague's site once, and I was just there with a friend, and they found out what I did, and they were a bison farm. And they said, hey, I really want to turn a section of this pasture, or I want to change a section of my land into pasture, but it had a wetland in it. Could you tell me what to do? And I wasn't there to contract. I was just visiting with a friend. I said, sure, just give me some time. I'm going to walk the land a bit and just be present to it. And something that I've come to realize is that I'm an advocate for the land first. I'm an advocate for my clients' money second, and I'm an advocate for their wants third, which sounds backwards, especially in our clients always right world. But as I was walking that land and as I was being present to it and just soaking it in, I came to a realization, and after about 10 minutes, I came back and I started talking to the guy. And I said, listen, this beautiful spot, beautiful piece of land, and this area here, this was a wetland before there were people on this planet. This was a wetland before there was First Nations on this land. This will be a wetland long after humans are done on this planet, and we will have our time. We will be done. And what I would do is I would accentuate that area. I would accentuate what it is instead of trying to force it to be something it's not. So I would probably bench this wet land, I would plant trees. I would plant tree fodder for your bison, or fodder or food for your family, and work it that way. And he said to me, he goes, I've had 10 different consultants over the last 5 years. I spent $10,000 on this conversation, and that's the most intelligent thing I've heard. So when we seek to be present with our landscapes in a deep listening way, we can start to get out of this mindset that the human mind always has to be thinking and understanding and developing and creating, and just be with your site. So one thing I might say is spend time in some of these eucalypt monocultures, spend time in areas that are threatened by bushfire, so you can actually get a sense of what that fuel looks like. It's a couple of years ago, I created a documentary called Facing Fire, Building Resiliency to Wildfire on my YouTube channel. It's a 22-minute documentary about how North America got to their wildfire situation. And something that I came to realize is there's a metric of site penetration to understand how much fuel there is in a forest. And until you're in the forest and looking through a forest, it's very difficult to mentally conjure that. And once you're in that forest and you're looking at it and you start to see it, you start to develop a second hand for it. And that'll be the case for a lot of the elements here in this course. Specifically, I'm thinking of, there's a ribbon test within the soil assignment that will take time for you to get a sense of the feel of soil in your fingers, because most of us don't spend a lot of time holding wet soil, and rubbing it through our fingers. So a lot of this takes time. So be kind with yourself. Be kind as you're going through this process. Be kind as you're learning. It'll take time. We have an invasive species here on the property that the owner really needs to get under control. Would you know of any time-efficient remedy, or could provide resources with detailed information? This regards Blackberry, really bad. It's everywhere. Figs and Eucalypt. I don't think I've ever heard anyone say that they want to get rid of figs. Yeah, so let's take a moment to kind of go patterns to detail. And it's only humans that tend to have it's only humans that tend to have an emotional attachment and then a judgment on what is invasive and what isn't. Regardless of the fact that it's under the same criteria, we could classify most people, most Homo sapiens, as invasive. So generally, we're going to find, and we're going to come onto sites where there are going to be desirable and undesirable plants, depending on the regulations, depending on the mental sphere of the clients we're working with. And there's always going to be one plant that's singled out that has some racism applied to it. All plants have functionality. All plants are functioning within a landscape in a certain way, shape, or form. So I say that to kind of crouch this conversation in. Let's be a bit more aware that there's no such thing as a good plant or a bad plant. There's just plants, and they're all applying their functionality. So if we do come into a species that are undesirable for that site, we don't want them there, there's a couple of ways to go about it. So generally, if we're taking a look at something like thorny brambles, things like blackberries, what can work, and it depends on your site, and it depends on what you're doing, and it depends on how you're working with this. But one of the things that I found is working with brambles, especially in this climate, is that brambles generally, as a form and functionality within climate, are trying to knit a landscape. They're usually trying to armor a landscape, and it usually has to do with soil deficiencies. So whenever I'm working with a pioneer, a poison, a prickly, pernicious plant, I have to think, if I'm removing that plant, am I going to supplant it? Am I going to replace it with something that is going to take up that functionality? Here in this climate, there's a plant called Scotch broom, and people get bonkers about getting it out, but it's a nitrogen fixer, and it tends to grow in very hard to grow areas. If you were going to give me a gravel yard and ask me to remediate it into soil, I'd probably use Scotch broom as one of those plants, because it's so incredibly tenacious. So if we are going to pull out Blackberry, if we are going to pull out something that's generally knitting, that's a biomass accumulator, it's developing a lot of biomass, what are we replacing it with? What is the analog plant that we're going to put in there? So know that first, because the moment that we start to create a vacuum, or we start to, etch a sketch a landscape and take things out, the genetic seed bank that's in the soil will be expressed. So we have to make that choice. This is where we get into one of our designing adages, which is the burden is on the designer. The burden is always upon us if we are implementing or if we are switching out plants to then put something back in that's going to take up that ecological niche within a landscape. So that would be my first conversation, is what are you replacing it with? And then in terms of removal, all plants have storages. So all plants have some kind of storage. Actually, I was just I'm visiting some friends right now, and they're growing onions, and they cut off the tops of all their onions without kind of knowing or understanding what an onion is. An onion is a storage capacity for a plant, and throughout the year they put up their shoots, and their shoots photosynthesize, and they put all that energy down to the bulb. And normally throughout the season, when you're growing onions, you're going to get to a point in time where you're going to start to stop watering them. That's then going to kill off the leaves. The leaves are then going to shunt all that energy down into the bulb. And then you're going to usually pull the bulb out and dry it in a shady spot and then store it for food and flavor. So within blackberries, within a lot of the brambles, a lot of their storage is going to be in their root system. So if you keep cutting the top, what do you expect is going to happen? Well, it's going to take that energy that's in the root and it's going to come back up and it's going to keep growing. So usually what we have to do is figure out where's the storage capacity in the plant. When is the plant at its most vulnerable? And then how can we influence the plant, or how can we induce death or removal of life vigor in the most efficient way possible? So generally, when we're dealing with undesirable plants that have root storage, usually what I'm going to do is scalp them down. This is without animals. If we have animals, it's a whole different story. So if we have pigs, I generally let them go after all of my plants. So I fence them in, and then the pigs are doing most of that work, which is great because we've got the ability to work with animals that are then working for us. But if that's not the case, then I'll usually scalp the blackberries down to the ground, and either I'll use a brush cutter or sometimes a chainsaw. And then if I'm focused on the least amount of effort possible, chances are I'm probably going to use something like high strength agricultural vinegar. That's usually at something like 12 or 15%. And I'm usually going to spray that down into the meristem of a blackberry cane or elm, or any of these plants that are usually quite pernicious. And what happens is, because of the xylem and phloem that's within the stem of a plant, that phloem is going to take whatever I put into that cut stem, and it's going to bring it down into the root zone. And because vinegar is a biocide, it will then bring that down into the root. And this may take multiple applications. This may take multiple years. But over time, what will happen is that that'll get sucked down into that root matter. And basically, you're suggesting very strongly that that plant should die. And then what I might do is I might solarize. So this is using tarps, usually thick tarps, so like 3, 6, or 9 mil. And basically, once I've done that cutting and I've done that spraying with agricultural vinegar, then I'm laying out a tarp, usually with the black side up, so it really heats up, becomes an undesirable climate. And this solarization can help to further create abiotic factors that will decrease the plant's vigor. Figs and eucalypts, generally trees, if I'm working with more time and have less effort or less labor, I usually girdle the trees, which is taking about an inch or 2 inches, 5 centimeters all the way around the tree, basically taking off the bark, taking off the cambium, and then stopping that transmission of photosynthetic capacity down into the roots and allowing it to die out. Or we can move back into the scalping and the spraying as well. Great questions. Number 5, my site is a wellness retreat and the owners would like to maintain a bit of lawn in front of the main building for guests to walk on. And for looks, I guess, if not watered all the time, the lawn turns to hay within 2 weeks during 3 dry summer months. Do you know tricks to maintain beautiful lawn with little input? There's a natural water fountain in the middle of the lawn. Maybe that helps. Can there modifications be done to turn the fountain into an irrigation system? Another possibility is to suggest ground cover plants such as thyme to replace the lawn, but I need a plant that can tolerate, at least to some extent, people walking over it. And that is very resilient, beautiful, and low maintenance. Do you have suggestions or maybe possible approaches? Not an easy task, I suppose. Yeah, so generally, this goes back to our question of, is it the right plant in the right place? So if you're in a place like Portugal, where you've got 3 or 4 months of drought, and you're trying to keep a grass alive that's probably outside of its successional ecology, you're always going to be having a project that takes a lot of work. It's always going to be the case. It's just, you have a plant out of space and time. And a lot of people within permaculture get a terrible affliction called out of zoneitis. It affects 9 out of 10 permaculturalists. And what ends up happening is they think, well, because permaculture, I can X, Y, Z. And I would suggest to everybody what we're trying to do instead is we are trying to find good fits for our areas, good fits for our specific sites and different elements. So I would say if you want to give it a go, things like aerated compost tea and extracts, which is taking compost, really living, active, alive compost, putting it into a stiff but porous bag, putting it into non-chlorinated, non-chlorinated water, and then running a pump that has a blower, so it blows air. It doesn't pump water, it pumps air, and bubbling that through this water volume to remove the microbes within that compost, and then applying that on lawn, applying that on soil, can help to increase the total populations of the living soil food web, which can then increase the potential for water holding capacity. I'll talk about this a lot. WHC, or water holding capacity, is the amount of water a soil body can hold. And we know that if we increase a % of organic matter on an acre of land, we increase the water holding capacity on that acre by 20,000 liters. So when we are trying to increase water holding capacity, or we're trying to reduce the drought capacity or the drought effects of an area, I'm always trying to increase water holding capacity. And usually without fail, it's always increasing organic matter. So ways to increase organic matter, as we were talking about, is aerated compost extract. It could be working with top dressing with compost, finely sifted compost as well. It could be integrating biochar, which is carbon material that has been burned in a low oxygen environment, which then allows for whatever carbon material, wood material that you're working with to have a lot of surface area and interstitial airspace, which allows for more water to hold onto that biochar. And then you can integrate that into soil, or do, again, top dressing because it's a lawn. But basically what you're trying to do is increase the water holding capacity of the lawn. In terms of plants that would be easy to have people walk over it, I'm a huge fan of woolly thyme. I think it's one of the best lawn replacements. It's beautiful, it's down and duffy. The one drawback is that it's flowering, so it attracts a lot of bees. So there's never going to be a perfect solution. If you do want something that can be walkable, woolly thyme is great, but tends to attract bees. People are walking on bees, usually gets stung. So one or both of those, and maybe starting to, maybe around the fountain, working with woolly thyme and having that kind of come into the lawn could create some more beauty as well. Could there be modifications to turn the fountain into an irrigation system? Possibly, but if you're using the fountain as an irrigation system, you're going to inherently be removing water from the fountain. So that would probably be a conversation you'd want to have with the clients if that was of interest, and just being conscientious about what that water source is and where it's coming from. Resilient, beautiful, and easy. Do you have a suggestion? Maybe other possible. Yeah. So I would try to increase the water holding capacity of the soil by introducing of organic matter in any one of the ways I was talking about. And I may start to slowly change it over into woolly thyme. Clover would be another conversation. Clover lawns are beautiful. Again, same issue with bees, but tend to take less water than your Kentucky bluegrass or other varieties. 5, the Moors, North African tribe, are Romans, left an irrigation system on the property, still visible in parts. Do you think it's worth trying to reintegrate into the design? Huh. Curious. Yeah, I would definitely be curious about kind of tracing the system and understanding how it was developed, and running water down if they're aquifers, or I'm not even totally sure. But I would start to detail, document, and describe what that looks like, and understand where it's going. Starting to detail it in a map, just so that way you can then have an understanding of it and see if there's actually any value, because there may be in terms of its distribution system if it's already been developed. Great questions. Off to a good start. Great. Awesome. All right. Well, thanks for the questions. That was amazing. I really appreciate that. I did get a question from somebody that emailed me, and this kind of brings us up to the template. So I think I'll just take a moment and come back here. So if you're brand new to Google Slides, it's like any other presentation software you've ever used, like PowerPoint or Keynote. But one thing that's really important, you'll see these little tabs here, video tutorials are found above the slides. Definitely go through these point by point before you reach out with questions, because somebody had just asked, how do I change this element, and how to edit the master slide and put your name in the portfolio is the tutorial to use. But you'll find that in each one of these tutorials, there's going to be, in each one of these slides, there's going to be tutorials that will walk you through every single element of the slide. And if you need extra help, feel free to reach out and send me an email, javan@allpointsdesign.ca. Happy to help you if we need to jump on a quick Zoom chat to work through something. And then over here, you'll see that we've got some examples. So I've been collecting these examples for the last number of student assignments, and we're still just populating from the last class. But what you'll find is we've got a number of different assignments here, different students who've developed the tutorials, developed their template through the tutorials. And it's a great way to start to take a look at what other people have done. And feel free to borrow or outright steal ideas that you find from other folks as well. And we're starting to get some details about the applications used and things like that. We're always getting questions from folks about what kind of software should people be using. What I'll say is this, is that if you don't previously have experience of using a software, don't spend this class learning a new piece of software. This isn't the class to do it. This is a class to learn about permaculture design process, to go through that design process. And if you add an application to it, you will become frustrated, guaranteed. This isn't the class to learn a brand new rendering type. Most individuals who go through a PDC, and this is true of even many of the online PDCs, there's no mentioning of software or the development of that type of skill. What we've done in this class is we've given you a fair amount of information through the template, as well as through Google Slides, to start to develop a visual understanding and a visual language to put things into some spatial awareness. What you'll hear from me in the tutorial is that if you're frustrated with moving things around digitally, just go back to paper and pencil. I still use paper and pencil to this day. I do it digitally though, because I work with an iPad, because I like drawing. Drawing's fun. And so I use a digital pad to do my drawings, and just working on a First Nation sustenance garden to feed 60 elders and 150 people in northern British Columbia. And I love the drawing aspect of it. So if you're finding that the Google Slides conversation is frustrating to you, don't worry about it. Pick up a piece of paper and a pencil and work with it that way, and then just take photos or scans of it and bring it into Google Slides. It'll make it a lot easier. What else do I want to tell you, fine folk? Can we ask extra questions here? Of course. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, put as many questions as you want, folks. I'll answer any questions there, or if somebody just wants to unmute and ask your question, that's fine as well. The nice thing about the Google document for our questions is if you have questions in between that you want answered during office hours, you can go there and put them there, and then in 2 weeks' time, I'll answer them. You can also send me an email. And then one of the things you'll find in the template, I'll just show this to everybody here, is at the end of the majority of the assignments, what you'll find is that there's going to be a little student question and feedback. So if you do have questions specific to your assignment and you want to put them here, I'll answer them. I tend to do video feedback, so I will do a video going through your assignment, making points and conversations about it. But this is another opportunity. The other thing I'll say, and I'll just bring this up here, so that way everybody can see what's going on. So this is our discussion group. So at the top, you're going to have the Zoom office hours. We have an open discussion panel, which means you can ask, if you've got a resource or you have a question kind of outside of the permaculture sphere, you can put it here. Basically, as we get into our assignments, I will pin the next assignment, and that will then come up to the top here. Somebody said, excuse me. Somebody said, can you reorder these so that they are in order? And yes, I do that throughout the class. But once we get into starting to submit our assignments, make sure, very important, make sure that you complete all the assignments in the week. So we've got personal survey, design, site, and climate survey. And then make sure that you list by clicking reply here. Make sure that you list and say, hey, Javan, here's my assignment 1, and then you link to your Google Slides. You'll also need to make sure that you're linking to the first slide in that week's assignments, but there's a tutorial about that as well. Okay, I'm going to go back to our list of questions. I think somebody had just put something down. One question, if you can answer now, if you're familiar with reeds, they're invasive in Baghdad suburbs, and I have my farm. I'm thinking of using them as mulch, biochar, use them in compost. Any suggestions? Yeah, all of those are great ideas. Yeah, I would say any of those. Generally, when I'm dealing with undesirable plants, they usually are great bioaccumulators or biomass creators. So we did this with Scotch broom. We've done this with reeds, like what you're talking about. I've done this with reed canary grass. Generally, if there's a plant that wants to produce a lot of biomass, I generally let it produce the biomass, and then I'm usually cutting it for composting or mulch. Depending on its fibrous structure, you may use it as biochar. If its carbon structure isn't as dense as something like wood, it can sometimes be more work than it's cut out for becoming biochar. So generally I'll use it for mulch and for compost. Generally, if I'm working with something that large for compost, I'm probably going to be working in piles versus any kind of structure. And being conscientious that if I'm cutting green, then I'm going to have to augment with a brown, and then I'm also going to have to augment with a nitrogen. So great question, though. That's awesome. Okay, just going to check and see if there's any other questions. Not seeing anything. Any questions from anybody who's on the call, either in our chat conversation or otherwise? Anything under the sun? And there's really no dumb question because we're all just starting out here.
Hey, Javan, I have a question for you. So I am in a roving training program, and I might not be in the location that I currently am at the end of this course. So I don't know if Kelda mentioned this to you, but what do you suggest that I do in that case? I very well may be here, but there's a possibility that I won't be.
Right. So I think your question pertains to what should you do for a site choice? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, that's right. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Okay. Well, and this kind of brings up the whole conversation about site. So you definitely need a site that you can access. If you can't access the site, it's going to be problematic. Or if you end up with a fictitious site, it's not going to be as useful for the course. So if you know generally the roving location, and if there's some place that's and if there's some place that's centralized that you can come back to or take a look at, or if there's a friend or family spot that you can come and at least visit once or twice throughout the course, I'd probably go with that, something that's repeatable that you can come to. It's just going to help you more so. If you can't, you can always just go with something that's fictitious and, you know, go with the city park that you're like, this was my place, I would do this and this. The problem with something like that is you'll end up creating a lot of, well, you'll end up creating a lot of fictitious questions and answers, and it's just less useful, you know, like the constraints of a design. This is something I learned later in my design life. Constraints are great. The more constraints you can get in a design, the better, because it just, a design emerges out of it. You know, if it can't go here and it can't go here, well, it can only go here. I'm working on a site down in the Olympic Peninsula in Washington, and they have covenants, they have ecological covenants on the site, and it immediately pulls out a third of the site from anything. Like, we can't do anything on that area. So that just becomes our zone 5, where we go and walk and view and potentially grab some material from. But similarly, if you end up having a fictitious site, it just becomes problematic. So if you can find something that you can come back to a few times and run, or a family member's place that you can come back to as you're roving throughout your program, that would be ideal. But if not, you can just go with a fictitious site.
All right. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're so welcome. You're so welcome. Anybody else as we come to the end of our time together?
I have a site that is going to have future demolition and construction on it. Are there permaculture methods for soil remediation that I should be looking at in particular?
Yeah, what kind of demolition?
There is currently a house and a garage on the site that will be torn down, and a new home is going to be built in its place.
Okay, awesome. So one of the things with construction is there's going to be compaction. And if you can inform those that are doing the demolition to keep the path of their demolition materials and equipment to a certain area, that can do as much as anything else, because compaction becomes such a problem in terms of water movement within a site, as well as the ability for plants to then be within that compaction. If you can minimize that compaction, minimize the treads of your excavators or your demolition equipment, that can be a huge help. So just the awareness of that can change. The clients I was talking about, they've got an excavator coming on site to develop their house pad. And one of the things that's, if you've ever worked with excavator drivers, they like to go all over the place and come at it from every angle just to make sure that they've covered their bases. Problem is that compaction takes, if you're not actively decompacting it mechanically, that can take up to 20 to 25 years to actually remediate with plants or just with the percussive effects of rainwater. So that would be the first thing. So minimize it to start off with. The second would be if they can work in specific piles as they're pulling things out. Again, I worked construction for a long time. Demolition's fun. We like swinging hammers, even if they're big hydraulic hammers. And if we can, instead of spreading out the debris, if we can pile it, again, if there is anything that's coming off of that, that can be relatively contained, that can be another useful piece. Then if we're moving into remediation, either phytoremediation or fungal remediation, there's a great book called Earth Repair by Lila Darwish, a colleague and friend of mine. She goes into detail the different types of remediation. But usually what we're worried about is the percussive effects of water coming onto demolition materials that have contaminants and then taking in solution in water, then into the soil. So again, if we can keep those things localized, then that works out well. If not, then we can work with things like the Helianthus family, so the sunflower family. They tend to be bioaccumulators. We can work with a number of fungi, which are bioaccumulators. The problem with bioaccumulators is they accumulate the issues that we have, and then they concentrate it. So having those now concentrated might mean that we can take them, but it also usually means that now we have contamination in a vegetative state. And this is where a lot of these soil remediation projects are taking the material out of a site and then taking that material, that vegetative material, and then putting it into incinerators. So it's always going to be about transit time. How much time does the contaminant have in terms of interaction with the fungi or with the plants? So generally, if we can, minimize at the beginning, and then Lila Darwish's book does a really good job. And we're potentially looking at doing a course with Lila in the next year. So if that's of interest, then definitely keep your ear to the mailing list. And the mailing list is on allpointsdesign.ca at the bottom if you do want to sign up. But great question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, pleasure. Any other questions?
Hi, John. I have a question.
Go ahead.
It's a little bit more about the learning process. So I'm someone who has no experience in any of this, or even like a natural science foundation. I'm sure some folks that take the class are kind of in this position, and appreciating that this involves such a confluence of so many different knowledge bases. I'm trying to understand, like, is it that, as you work site by site, you kind of slowly piece together a knowledge base of plants, and is it kind of like trusting that you learn as you go with the foundation of what we learned through the class, to build that literacy?
Great question. Great
Okay.
question. So 15 years ago, when I took my first PDC, I knew what plants burned well because I was in Boy Scouts for a long time. And that was the sum total of my natural history knowledge. I do not have a natural science background. I did not go to school. Everything I know, I've learned on the job, and I've learned through short courses and long courses and just beating my head against books and beating my head against nature, because the book of nature is always open, and it's always open for us to read. We just have to go out and read it and be ready to read it again when, not if, we read it wrong. So I hear you completely. My first instructor, who has now become one of my closest friends, is an encyclopedic plant guru. He can tell you the plant by eyesight. He can give you the Latin. He can give you the common. He can tell you how to propagate it. He can tell you its genetic tree. That's not me. That is not me. So I hear you in this, that it takes time. What I've come to realize is as you're going through this PDC, be conscientious about what it is that you gravitate towards. And the way that I do this is I usually take 2 pages in a notebook. On one page, I write fire at the top. On the other page, on the top, I write compost, fire and compost, fire and compost. And as I go through the different sections, I'm basically writing down the things that are firing me up, what I'm really enjoying, what's exciting to me. And on the compost side, it's like all the things that are going to the compost to potentially have somebody else do because I don't want to do it. And what this ends up doing is you become very specific about what about this wonderful banquet of permaculture is exciting to you and makes you really stoked, and what about it that really doesn't. So if the knowledge base, if all the different data points that we're going to be going through feels overwhelming, this can be a nice way of starting to delineate through this. The second thing I would recommend is be conscientious that you're not going to learn everything within one class. It's not possible. A lot of you during your first assignment, you'll be asked about your expectations of the class. And if your expectations is, I will know how to design any site on the planet at the end of this 20-week course, that's not realistic. It took me 3 years after my first PDC and a lot of practice and a lot of failure to be any place where I was actually able to look at a site and start to make intelligent observations. It takes time. You'll have a chance to go through one site, through a design process, develop a documentation process, and depending on how well you do that, you then may be eligible to do another one. Or if you do it poorly, you may be eligible to go back and go through the course again through a different site. So it takes time to develop this skill. It's a skill that takes a fair amount of humility because you're not going to remember everything on the first go. And I lean on Einstein's brilliant quote, don't memorize anything that you can look up. So I still use the Natural Capital Plant Database as my primary plant research site because it's so brilliant. It's created by permaculturalists. It's cross-referenced. And it's a wonderful site to use. I still do it to this day. And yet over the years, over a decade and a half and a few concussions, I still have to look things up because they haven't, somebody will show me a plant that I've worked with for years. And I'm like, I know this one. I've worked with this one. I don't remember this one. And so I still have to go back to that. Yeah, it's called the Natural Capital Plant Database. Natural Capital Plant Database. Yeah, it's $25 a year. So worth it. It's going to make your life very easy. There's also things like Plants for a Future, but it's not cross-referenced. It doesn't have this amazing database. Natural Capital Plant Database was created by Paula Westmoreland and Dan Housley and his French kiss, the chef's kiss, beautiful, fantastic. Oh yeah, thanks for that there. Awesome. So that's part of it. If you can look it up, then great. What I would recommend is really focus on the first principles we're going to talk about throughout the class. And you'll find that when I answer questions, and I'm already doing it here, I'm going from patterns to details. I'm passing on the first principle. So that way, when you come to a question, you can think, yeah, Javan's already taught me about water holding capacity. If I need to increase water holding capacity, I have to increase organic matter. What's the organic matter I have at hand? It's always going to be contextually based. This is the cool thing, and why I've been involved in permaculture and regenerative land design as long as I have, is because every site is so different. I potentially will be working in Egypt on a farm to table resort to take this site and produce all the food for the resort. But the principles are the same no matter where you go in the world. This is the fun thing about this conversation is once you have an idea of how water flows, once you have an idea about climate, once you have an idea that plants that are nitrogen fixers have a very specific leaf pattern, you can go anywhere and go, oh, that's a nitrogen fixing tree. I have no idea what it is, but I know it fixes nitrogen. And then it's a little bit of decoding of that landscape that allows you then to get deeper and deeper and deeper into a conversation. The other thing that I think is really important, and this is where my experience with life design, and I'm noticing the time, so I'll wrap up here, is while you have all come into the pro class, and so I imagine on some level there's a desire to become a designer in some way, shape, or form, the specific flavor of design that you may be involved in is very specific to you. And I would be remiss to say that you should become like me or Andrew or Jeff Lawton or Robin Francis. All of us have a very specific view set in which way we look through the world, and we all work in a very specific way. I like working at broad scale. I like working on these large scale landscapes. I like working with water. These are things that excite me. You may not want to do that. You may want to design and develop specifically in an area. One of the smartest people I know, I was just talking about him, about the rainwater harvesting course, Gord Baird. Gord has probably one of the most beautiful, incredible sites I've ever seen in the world called eco-sense.ca, eco-sense.ca. He has a 2-story cob load-bearing building that won the Living Building Challenge. Plus, he and his wife grow about 90% of their own food. Plus, they're both mad scientists, and they invent and create all of these incredible things, like taking the excess power from their photovoltaic system and running it through a dehydrator on the backside of their house. You know, all of these little things, so beautiful. But he could do anything, but he loves water. So he's become the go-to guy when it comes for rainwater harvesting. It's just incredible. And after us working together years ago, and then us going off and doing our separate thing and coming back together, it's incredible to watch how much intelligence he's grown around this and how much specificity he's grown. So like the person who was talking about Portugal, you know, if you become very skilled in developing strategies around water harvesting and conservation in Portugal or in arid climates, that can be the design that you excel at. You don't have to be good at everything. And that's going to be the main thing you'll have to be conscientious of, because people who are in permaculture get very excited about the new shiny thing. Oh, there's this new shiny thing I need to learn about and write about and listen about and have 25 tabs open on my computer. You have to temper that to, who am I? What do I want to work on? What's the people or the scale or the scope that I like working with? And then just be dedicated to developing a skill set around that. And we can talk about that more as we go throughout the class, because I've become a little bit skilled in helping people develop into business out of courses and just with colleagues, because I've been really specific in how I've gone about it. It's so true, about 25 tabs open right now, swamped with the learning potential. Yeah, that's where that fire and compost list is helpful, because it really helps you to narrow down on what you want to do. And so I'll finish with this. I'll finish with this story, and then I'll let everybody go. So as I was starting to develop life design through ecological principles, I was speaking at a conference called Permaculture Voices years ago. And I talked about this idea of, we all have a certain inflection point within our personality and who we are that gives us an edge over anybody else. There's something about who we are and how we operate. For example, I like working in life design. I like understanding somebody's inflection point and helping them to bring that to bear. Not everybody does. A lot of people just like to work with the pipes and infrastructure, and they don't like working in the muddy area of people's desires and wants and limiting beliefs and all that. So I was given this presentation, and there was this quote that has been near and dear to my heart by Larry Santoyo, who was a former LAPD police officer turned permaculturalist, which is, you don't do permaculture, you use permaculture in what you do. So there's already a huge amount of skill and ability that you bring to this conversation. If you're brand new to ecology, you've never dug a tree before, you're probably not eligible for a full design business after this course. You're eligible to be interested in it, but you're probably not eligible to go out and have somebody pay you to do that because you don't have an experience. So you have to go and learn that experience. So as I was talking about this to this group, I finished and I walked to the back, and I had this 50-year-old guy come up to me, and I was young. I was like mid-20s at that time, late 20s. And he says, "I think you saved my life." I was like, "What are you talking about?" I just talked about, like, don't try and be everybody else out there. And he goes, "Well, I'm a mechanic. I've always been a mechanic. It's like granddad did it and dad did it and I did it. And then I took a PDC a couple of years ago and thought I need to be a composter like my instructor. So I kind of gave up my shop for a while. I stopped working there, and I've just been trying to make compost for the last 3 years, and I suck at it. I'm terrible at it. And it's not just that I suck at it, I hate it. I don't like doing it. It's not close to my context, not close to who I am. It's not my zone of brilliance. And I think you just told me I don't have to be a composter. I get to be a mechanic who uses permaculture in my mechanicking. I get to work with and develop mushrooms that potentially can eat up the motor oil that comes off of the cars, and he had all these ideas. It was just coming fast and furious. And it was one of those moments where I realized that something that had been so internalized in me just because of how I was raised and how I've gone throughout life, to not miss the opportunity that I have to offer what I bring specially and uniquely to this world and have interest into to bring, to lose that by trying to become whoever it is that I'm trying to emulate. So there's a saying that says, don't seek the men of old, seek what they sought. Seek that conversation that they were looking for. They were looking for whatever it is, that golden element that they were seeking, which was that sense of essence, the essence of who they are to be expressed. So while you're going through the course and you're learning about all these different subjects and all these different conversations, and you're going to learn formulas and you're going to learn specific techniques and strategies and patterns and all the rest of it, don't forget to check in every once in a while and go, what about this am I loving? What about this am I pulled towards? And what about this do I not love? And again, you can use that fire and compost list. And at the end of the class, I'll give you another set of instructions about how to further delineate all those different elements. Okay. Any final questions before we say goodbye for now? And I set you guys off to your first assignment. Awesome. Oh, you're welcome. Yeah, you're welcome. Hey, Kenna, nice to see you again. Awesome. Well, folks, super great pleasure to meet you all. This is going to be a real fun time. Remember, we all have to learn from mistakes. They just don't have to be our own. So do take the time to reach out if you're having problems. You really don't have to suffer. I can usually set people straight pretty quickly. If you're having problems with the template, again, reach out as well. Happy to help anybody. And if you do need some special help and we can just jump on a Zoom, it's a great pleasure to make sure that you're in the right spot. With that, I will see all of you fantastic folks in 2 weeks. And yeah, thanks for all the thanks. Look at all this. This is so awesome. Yeah, I think we've got a really great group this time. I think this will be a lot of fun. Make sure to reach out to each other and say hello. And we'll see you in a couple of weeks. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, Javan. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.